Good day everyone, we are the Group 3 from NR32 and we will be discussing about reconstructing and analyzing arguments, logic, and critical thinking. Our presentation includes introduction, arguments versus explanation, formal methods of evaluating arguments, negation, and disjunction. First is the introduction, which will be presented by Aliyah Abrigo and Angelica Portes.
What is an argument? So, an argument is the act or process of arguing, reasoning, or discussing. In logic and philosophy, an argument is a series of statements, says, intended to determine the degree of truth of another statement or the conclusion. The argument itself is independent of one's attempt to use it to convince or persuade. So I've said that the argument is a set of statements. So ano nga bang statement? A statement in logic, the term statement is variously understood to mean either a meaningful declarative sentence that is true or false, or a proposition which is the assertion that is made by a true or false declarative sentence. A type of sentence that can be true or false and corresponds to the grammatical category declarative sentence. So let's say, for example, a sentence that says the Nile is a river in northeastern Africa. So it is a statement. Why? Because it makes sense to inquire whether it is true or false. And a sentence is still a statement even if it's false. So, for example, the Yangtze is a river in Japan. It is still a statement. It's just a false statement because the Yangtze River is in China. Now, the following sentence says, don't tell your mother about the surprise, and do you like Vietnamese food are not a statement. So the reason that none of these sentences are statements is that it doesn't make sense to ask whether those sentences are true or false. All arguments are composed of premises and conclusions, which are both types of statement. Now, what is a premise and a conclusion? When we say premise, a statement in an argument that provides reason or support for the conclusion. There can be one or many premises in a single argument. While conclusion, it is a proposition that follows logically from the major and minor premises in a syllogism. An argument is considered to be successful or valid when the premises are true or believable, and the premises support the conclusion. I'll give an example of an argument. An argument about abortion. Someone would say abortion is morally wrong because it is wrong to take the life of an innocent human being. And if fetus is an innocent human being, we could capture the structure of that argument like premise number 1, it is morally wrong to take the life of an innocent human being. Premise number 2, a fetus is an innocent human being. And the conclusion would be, therefore, abortion is morally wrong. So this kind of structure is what we call putting an argument into standard argument form. So a standard argument form, it is a way of presenting the argument which makes clear which statements are premises, how many premises there are, and which statements in the conclusion. In standard form, the conclusion of the argument is listed last.
The first stage in critical thinking is argument identification. Given that some of what people say and do is not argumentative, one must be able to distinguish the arguments from other types of expression. There are 3 steps to argument identification. First is understand the context. Second, identify the conclusion. And last, identify the reasons. If you wish to become skilled at grappling with arguments, you must become skilled at spotting them. And if you want to become skilled at spotting them, it helps to know where they are typically found. Knowing the argument context puts you ahead of the game as a critical thinker It puts you on your guard, inclining you to take care, so as not to be taken in by an argument that is not really compelling. In general, we are pretty aware of the obvious argument, context, debates, classrooms, the media, political discussions among friends, etc. We are also sensitive to certain words and phrases that mark arguments. Example given is argument, my view, my opinion, what you should think. The first step in enhancing critical thinking ability, though, requires careful reflection on this awareness. Typically, the main purpose of an argument is to press point. That is, arguments are vehicles intended to convince or compel people to believe something. This something is what we have called the conclusion. Whether the argument works or not depends on whether it applies compelling reason to believe this conclusion. But first things first, you can't assess the effectiveness of an argument without first identifying its conclusion. As with argument context, you can enhance your critical thinking ability by learning of ways to identify the conclusion of arguments. Most of the time, this won't be too difficult. After all, it is in the best interest of the arguer that their conclusion be clear. This can be done in several ways. One technique is to position the conclusion prominently at the beginning or the end of the argument. At the beginning or end of the paragraph that contains the argument, another is to repeat the conclusion during the course of the argument several times, calling attention to the fact that it is the most important point. Finally, there are words and phrases whose primary purpose is to introduce the conclusion. Call these conclusion markers. Conclusion markers include the following: therefore, thus, hence, as a result, in that case, then, so, accordingly, the bottom line, as a consequence, and for this reason. Be careful though, not all appearances of these terms mark conclusions. For example, then often indicates the next event in a series of events. The other essential part of the argument that one must identify are the reasons. There are claims that support the conclusion. As their name suggests, they give you reasons to believe it. Without them, there is no argument, just a claim. As with conclusions, there are ways to identify reasons. One fast and loose method is to take everything that isn't a conclusion in the argument to be reason. However, as we will see in the next section, this will give you false positive, that is, claims that are considered reasons, without actually being reasons. Since arguments often contain claims that serve other purpose, the most effective method is to look for reason markers. These terms include the following: because, since, for, in light of, reason, assume, according to, considering, by, if, in fact, etc. As before, you need to take care when evaluating appearances of these terms. Not all appearances mark reasons.
The next topic is all about arguments versus explanation, which will be discussed by Ms. Micaela Erineo and yours truly.
Hi, I am Micaela Erineo and I will discuss explanation. In my report, you will know about the meaning, importance, and how you will use explanation in a better way.
Arguments. So far, I have defined arguments in terms of premises and conclusions, where the premises are supposed to provide a reason, like support or evidence, for accepting the conclusion.
So for continuation, however, sometimes we already know that a statement or claim is true and we are trying to establish why it is true rather than it is true. An argument that attempts to show why its conclusion is true is an explanation.
What is an argument? An argument is a list of statements, one of which is the conclusion and the others are the premises or assumptions of the argument. Arguments contain statements or declarative sentences. Statements, unlike questions or commands, have a truth value. Statements assert that the world is a particular way. Questions do not. Here is an example of an argument. If you want to find a good job, you should work hard. You do want to find a good job, so you should work hard. The first two sentences here are the premises of the argument, and the last sentence is the conclusion. To give this argument is to offer the premises as reasons for accepting the conclusion. Here are the three important things to remember here. Arguments contain statements, they have a conclusion, they have at least one premise. What is a non-argument? One thing that complicates our task of identifying arguments is that there are many passages that, although they look like arguments, are not arguments. The most common types are explanations, mere assertions, conditional statements, and loosely connected statements. Evaluating arguments. The first step in evaluating an argument is to determine what kind of argument it is. We initially categorize arguments as either deductive or inductive, defined roughly in terms of their goals. In deductive arguments, the truth of the premises is intended to absolutely establish the truth of the conclusion. For inductive arguments, the truth of the premises is only intended to establish the probable truth of the conclusion. Valid. An argument is valid if and only if it is impossible for the premises to be true and to the conclusion to be false. Invalid. An argument is invalid if and only if it is not valid.
So first, what is explanation? An explanation is a set of statements usually constructed to describe a set of facts which clarifies the causes, context, and consequences of those facts. It is a communication that is designed to convey meaning such as information, emotion, or conjecture. It helps explaining things clearly. And clear explanations tend to help people and make clear decisions. So, explanation of human behavior typically appeal to the subject's beliefs and desires because it attempts to show why its conclusion is true. Note that if proper explanations are not given, then misinterpretation and ignorance will exist. The difference between argument and explanation is an argument claims to show that something is true, while an explanation aims to show why a statement is true. So let's see these examples. Number one, the reason that the rate of obesity is on the rise in the US is that the foods we most often consume over the past 4 decades have increasingly contained high levels of sugar and low levels of dietary fiber. Since eating foods high in sugar and low in fiber triggers the insulin system to start storing those calories as fat, it follows that people who consume foods high in sugar and low in fiber will tend to store more of the calories consumed as fat. This passage gives an explanation for why obesity is on the rise in the US. Here it is taken for granted that obesity is on the rise in the US. That is the claim whose truth we are trying to explain. We can put the obesity explanation into standard form just like any other argument. So, let's move on to the following premises and conclusion of the argument. Number one, over the past 4 decades, Americans have increasingly consumed foods high in sugar and low in fiber. Two, consuming foods high in sugar and low in fiber triggers the insulin system to start storing those calories as fat. Three, when people store more calories as fat, they tend to become obese. Four, therefore, the rate of obesity is on the rise in the US. Notice that in this explanation, the premises from 1 to 3 attempt to give a reason for why the conclusion is true, rather than a reason for thinking that the conclusion is true. That is an explanation. We assume that what we are trying to explain, the explanation is true. In this case, the premises are supposed to show why we should expect or predict that the conclusion is true. Explanations often give us an understanding of why the conclusion is true. We can think of explanations as a type of argument. We just have to distinguish two different types of argument. First, those that attempt to establish that their conclusion is true, which is the arguments, and those that attempt to establish why their conclusion is true, which is the explanations. So how to create a good explanation? First, construct an explanation of observed relationships such as the distribution of plants in the backyard. Second, use evidence like for measurements, observations, or patterns to construct or support an explanation or design a solution to a problem. Third is identify the evidence that supports particular points in an explanation. Then apply scientific ideas to solve design problems. Then, generate and compare multiple solutions to a problem based on how well they meet the criteria and constraints of the design solution.
So the next topic is formal methods of evaluating arguments, which will be presented by Pastora Berondo and Christian Espineda.
Balik tayo sa validity kung saan true yung premises and true yung conclusion. Vice versa ng invalid argument. So sa informal test of validity, it relies on our ability to imagine certain kinds of scenarios and statements involved in the argument. Dahil meron tayong pagkakaiba ng pagkakaintindi, pati power of imagination, sa informal test of validity is neither precise nor objective. Example, si Boy kaya mag-imagine ng scenario kung saan true yung premises pero false yung conclusion. Tapos si girl hindi kaya. So kay Boy, classified siya as invalid argument, while sa girl, classified siya as valid argument. Sa formal method of evaluation naman is to eliminate any imprecision or lack of objectivity. And we can apply it without using imagination, which will be explained further by Mrs. Brown.
So for the continuation, informal method of evaluation, we do not need to understand the statement. We just need to evaluate the argument. So for example is, all girls are mother, all mothers are women, therefore all girls are women. So the argument is valid and unsound. Why? Because there are two premises, one conclusion, and no logical fallacy. It means that the argument is good argument. And also, it is a valid argument because the premise and conclusion are logically true, and unsound because there is one false premises in the argument. So next is conjunction. Here in conjunction, we need two simple statements connected using the word and. So we use conjunction and to connect the two related statements. And the symbol used for conjunction is like inverted V. So for example is, Willie Ong is a doctor and cardiologist. So the P and Q is symbolizes as simple statement. So P is Willie Ong is a doctor, Q is Willie Ong is a cardiologist, and the conjunction is and.
The last topic is negation and disjunction, presented by Rica May Aguilar and myself, Teresia Rosel. So, definition. Disjunction. A disjunction is a truth functional statement that is true in every instance except where both of the junctions are false. The English word that most commonly functions as disjunction is the word or. What is negation? Negation is a truth functional operator that switches the truth value of a proposition from false to true or from true to false. So, yung isang positive sentence, pwede natin siyang i-transform into a negative sentence by adding the negative morpheme sa isang verb phrase. So, bakit natin kailangan yung negation sa logic? Negations are the logical equivalent of not or opposite. Negation is needed so that the opposite of propositions can be easily described and evaluated. For example, dogs are mammals. This is a true statement. Dogs are really mammals, but we can make that statement false by adding a negation with the phrase, it is not the case that, like this. It is not the case that dogs are mammals. So we made the true statement became a false statement. Another example is, Cincinnati is the capital of Ohio. So this is a false statement. So we can make it true by adding a negation. Cincinnati is not the capital of Ohio. So we made the false statement became a true statement. So we have here the truth table. In the following table, the symbol we will use to represent the negation is called the tilde. So, P and P with the tilde, this truth table represents the meaning of the truth functional connective negation, which is represented by the tilde in our symbolic language. The header row of the table represents some proposition P and the negation of that proposition, the one with the tilde. A truth table is a tabular representation of all the combinations of values of inputs and their corresponding negation outputs.
Now, I will introduce our next truth functional connective, disjunction. Disjunction is basically a logical operator used between two propositions whose truth value is true when either or both the propositions are true. Another definition is a disjunction is a truth functional statement that is true in every instance except where both of the disjuncts are false. The English word that most commonly functions as disjunctions is the word or, and it is also common that the or is preceded by an either in the sentence like in our example below. Either Charlie or Violet trucked mud through the house. If the fact that Charlie trucked mud through the house, the statement is true. If the fact that Violet trucked mud through the house, the statement is also true. This statement would also be true even if it was both Charlie and Violet who trucked mud through the house. This statement is only false if in fact neither Charlie nor Violet trucked mud through the house. Below is the truth table for disjunction. In our symbolic language, the symbol we will use to represent a disjunction is called a wedge. You can simply use a lowercase v to write the wedge. The header of this truth table represents the two propositions which are the first two columns of the table, and their disjunction which is the last column. The following four rows represent the conditions under which the disjunction is true. As we can see on the table, the first three rows are when the disjunction is true, when at least one of its disjuncts is true, including when they are both true. And in the last row, a disjunction is false only if both disjuncts are false. As we have defined it, the wedge is what we call an inclusive or. An inclusive or is a disjunction that is true even when both disjuncts are true. However, sometimes a disjunction clearly implies that the statement is true only if either one or the other of the disjuncts is true, but not both, and this is what we call an exclusive or. We can clearly understand this when we look at the truth table below. The reason we interpret the wedge as an inclusive or rather as an exclusive or is that while we can build an exclusive or out of the combination of an inclusive or and other truth functional connectives, as I've just pointed out, there is no way to build an inclusive or out of the exclusive or and other truth functional connectives.
And that is the end of our report. Thank you for listening, and if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to ask. Again, thank you and goodbye.